Hello, welcome to this series of videos, which I've sort of rather grandiosely referred to as the Blythe tapes. It's intended to be a series of interviews with people in publishing, writers, editors, artists, and we talk really about the approach that people have to their work and how they got involved and where they're going and the creative process and so forth. So I'm very pleased to say that today my guest is David Bishop, also known as DV Bishop. He is most recently the author of City of Vengeance, which you'll see very proudly displayed there behind him. David has also been the author of some Doctor Who books and Judge Dredd, and I believe thousands of pages of comics, and is an award-winning screenwriter. And he also runs the creative writing program at Edinburgh Napier University. So you're a busy man, David.
Yes, sleepers for tortoises, as a great man once said.
Indeed, the doctor himself, yes. So, I mean, looking back on the sort of breadth of writing experience that you've got, do you sometimes, I mean, I've got quite a diverse career as well, and do you sometimes look back at it and think, my goodness, did I really do all that? And was that all really me?
Yes, is the short answer. Yeah, I do slightly feel if I focused my attention in a smaller number of areas, I might have made more progress. I'm constantly telling my students, whatever you do, don't try and advance on 7 fronts at the same time, because that, as a strategy for war, that never succeeds.
Indeed.
And having written computer games, TV dramas, radio plays, audio dramas, tie-in novels, there's at least 2 other things I can't remember. Oh, comics and graphic novels, and a load of non-fiction at the same time. Yeah, it's hard to advance on all those fronts simultaneously and make meaningful progress. It's more effective if you can sort of narrow your focus to 2 or 3 areas and, you know, try and be the best you can at those rather than try and do everything.
Yeah, I'm very envious of those novelists who are in a position to, you know, turn out something reasonably similar every year to 18 months and, you know, get themselves into a series. And but then again, I like to be challenged and do different things. And, you know, and like you, I've done fiction, non-fiction, I've done stuff for kids and for adults. And it's good, I think, to keep ourselves diverse, and to.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And it is noticeable, even those, you know, the hugely successful authors, the sort of the Ian Rankins or Val McDermid's or even your J.K. Rowling's, do other things as well. Do screenwriting, will be involved in plays, write librettos for operettas. You know, they don't restrict themselves to one thing. They may be best known and established in one area, but they will vary the palette. Even short stories, you know, it's a very different form, short stories, from the novel. So
right. I mean, readers don't often realize, actually, I mean, the number of times that writers have to reinvent themselves too. I mean, and do other genres under different names. It was a long time before I discovered that, for example, Julian Barnes did his detective novels as Dan Kavanagh, and that Dan Kavanagh was Julian Barnes, and he kept the 2 separate. And I mean, the most obvious one is people will know is Ruth Rendell and Barbara Vine, but there are ways of sectioning off areas of writing. So, I mean, you've done a bit of a J.K. Rowling with this book, of course, because you've become DV rather than David. Is that a conscious decision to separate the series, the Aldo series, off from the rest of your writing?
Yeah, to an extent, but also I was very conscious that when I'd always wanted to write crime, and I'd sort of written a load of crime stories in other areas. So if I was writing, I don't know, Warhammer novels, which I did, basically it was Hill Street Blues with elves. I just couldn't help myself. So I'd written a lot of things in a lot of different genres. So, but when the time came to sort of write my own crime novel, one of the first things I did, I went, well, I should probably go and check and see how many other David Bishops are writing crime fiction. And there's an American author called David Bishop who publishes as David Bishop and who's written a load of, I think, largely self-published crime fiction. I wouldn't get into the quality or not of his work. That's for others to judge. But it was very obvious that there might be a clash there. So I thought, well, you know, like actors who can't have the same name, it probably makes commercial sense, if nothing else, to come up with some sort of pseudonym. And also to distinguish DV Bishop from David Bishop. It means that, you know, Pam Macmillan, who published City of Vengeance, can call it a crime debut, which it absolutely is. And it's a new name for publishing purposes. And also because it's historical fiction, an awful lot of historical crime writers, its sort of initial surname is almost the formula that you find for S.J. Paris and C.J. Sampson, and the list goes on. So it was like, well, in which case it will be Bishop, and then come up with some initials to go in front. And so
Yeah,
yes,
good idea.
D is me, David, and V is for my grandfather, whose surname was Volmer. So
Okay, I was going to ask you about the V. Right, yeah. I've been very lucky because there aren't any other Daniel Blythes, as far as I'm aware, who are writing. There is an agent called Blythe Daniel, who I've been confused with a couple of times, and she's American and female, so I don't know how people have managed to confuse me and her. But I did once go into a school where the school library was emblazoned with covers of my books, but somebody else's photo, someone who wasn't even a writer, just a random Daniel Blythe that they'd found on the internet.
going on Google and oh, this is what he looks like, and then you turn up and they're like,
he was about 10 years older than me and balding, and so it wasn't a fully flattering image.
They went, who's this hunk that's appeared?
I'm sure he's a very nice man, but he's not a writer, you know. So let's go back a bit. We'll talk a bit about City of Vengeance shortly, but I mean, the thing that we have in common, when we contributed to Virgin Books, Doctor Who books many years ago, and a lot of us took the approach of going in with either one of the new adventures to broad and deep for the small screen, or the missing adventures, which are slotted in between the existing stories. And a lot of people, of course, have gone on to do many other great things since being in that series. You took a slightly different approach because you had your slightly sort of unusual contribution to the series, which was Who Killed Kennedy, which wasn't really, it couldn't really be classified as one of the new or the missing adventures, really. And it's sort of fictionalized journalistic history by this chap called James Stevens, bringing together all of the master stories and the unit stories and so on. So what drove you to take that particular approach?
Well, oh gosh, it's a while ago, so I'll dredge back into the memory banks. I mean, I'd always wanted to write Doctor Who novels. I grew up watching Doctor Who, reading, you know, novelizations, Malcolm Hulke, and endless Terrance Dicks, like an awful lot of Doctor Who authors, you know, cut my teeth on those. And so I always wanted to write original Doctor Who. And then I moved from New Zealand to the UK in 1990, and ended up writing 4 Virgin books, but they got the license to publish Judge Dredd original novels. So I wrote 3 of those for Virgin, which is sort of my tryout for, and now can I have a crack at Doctor Who, please? So I pitched a few ideas to the Virgin editorial team, in particular, Rebecca Levine and Bex. And I would visit them often and go over to the offices in Ladbroke Grove at the time and come up with ideas and pitch them. They'd be like, and my biggest problem I had was every time I tried to pitch an idea, I go, oh, I'd have a brilliant idea for a story. And I go, oh no, that's Talons of Wing Chiang. Oh, or I do something else. I go, oh no, that's just Pyramids of Mars. And I was having a real problem sort of escaping my influences.
We all have this, yes. Oh, I've got a great idea and it's been done. Oh no, yes.
Yeah.
So it was your way to do something thoroughly original then, really.
I know, it's really hard. I remember once Big Finish, when Gary Russell was still running it, offered me, oh, you could do a 5th Doctor audio drama, original audio drama. Oh, that'd be great. And with this companion, brilliant. And the Daleks in it. And my heart just fell. I just went, I have nothing to say about the Daleks.
Right.
And so I went, I'm going to have to turn this down. I can't believe I'm turning down a main Doctor range with Peter Davison, but I have nothing to say about the Daleks. So pick somebody else, which ironically ended up being Chris Bidmead's Revelation or whatever it was, something of the Daleks.
Oh, yes.
Which is not the most popular of all the stories ever told. But anyway, that's by the by. Back to Who Killed Kennedy as I divert off the path. So what actually happened was there was a Marvel Comics miniseries called Marvels, and it has this character of a photojournalist, and he observes the beginnings of sort of the Marvel's universe. The Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Galactus appears, all these sorts of things, the first appearance of the X-Men. Yeah. And it's all very firmly rooted in the 60s and real history, but it's sort of like an ordinary person's perspective on these extraordinary events. And I went, oh, that's so cool. Somebody should do that for Doctor Who. I should do that for Doctor Who. And so that's what I pitched. And I was lucky because the Virgin Comics team were well into their comics, and they read a lot of Marvel comics at the time, Bex in particular. And I think she'd either read Marvels or I lent her my copy of the collection. And she was like, yeah, no, that's a good idea. So then it was all the research in the world.
I suppose,
both in terms.
yeah. I mean, as you say, the connection with the comics. I mean, I wasn't a great comics reader growing up, so I'm fairly ignorant about it. But the idea of writing in the Doctor Who universe and writing in the universe of something like Judge Dredd, 2000 AD, we're custodians really of those legendary characters, aren't we? And we feel that we've got to contribute our own story, but it's got to be something original. But at the same time, we're sort of quite constrained by what we can and can't do, the things that we can and can't change. Which is the problem with doing things like Missing Adventures and old Big Finish stories and so on. I mean, how was it writing for comics? I mean, you know, you wrote for these sort of legendary characters, things like the Phantom and Judge Dredd, and people love. And how, you know, how sort of limited were you in what you can and can't do? I know you were in charge of Judge Dredd for a long time. You were the editor of the magazine, so presumably you got to decide what you could and couldn't do.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, with anything like that, any sort of license tie-in, what intellectual property IP, generally it's the equivalent of hiring a sports car, and it's really shiny. You've always wanted to drive it, and you get to take it out and go as fast as you possibly can without being arrested, but you have to bring it back in one piece.
Crash it or get stains on the seats. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a big red reset button at the end of most tie-in novels or audio dramas, whatever it is, that says nothing has fundamentally changed, which is slightly dispiriting as a storyteller, because you're like, nothing I do can make any difference whatsoever. You're trapped in your own narrative Groundhog Day.
Yeah, right. I remember when we were doing the New Adventures, and Matthew Kilburn, who's a friend of mine, who's also a Doctor Who reviewer, mentioned that they seem to be dancing on 3 dots, which was a very good way of describing the way the New Adventures were kind of really.
Yeah, and it is the challenge of any kind of IP. And weirdly, having moved into writing a historical crime, it's kind of the same thing, because there's a series of constraints. You know, if you decide you're writing historical fiction with crime or some other subgenre within historical fiction, and most authors will choose to be as historically accurate as they can be. So therefore, you have a choice. Either history or continuity, in the case of IP, is either your straitjacket, or you can look at it that way, or you can look at it as just simply another constraint, which is no different from if you're writing traditional romance, they end up together at the end. If you're writing horror, there should be some sort of fear, hopefully generated in the readership. There's a monster of some sort, whether it's psychological or literal. So it's just another constraint, and it's how much of you choose to see that as a helpful frame, so that you're not trying to fill up the infinite canvas of narrative with your witterings, or whether you see it as a constraint or as a straitjacket that's stopping you being more creative than you want to be. You know, I mean, there are plenty of, certainly Doctor Who writers, there's been the old iconoclast along the way who've done their best to sort of hurl the rattles as far away out of the TARDIS as humanly possible, or even inhumanly possible, and who want to upset the apple cart and draw attention. I mean, Who Killed Kennedy kind of does that, because notoriously it does terrible things to the former companion Dodo Chaplet, which people still upbraid me about.
Not so many terrible things as some other writers did, as I recall, but
well, yes, the whole space STD incident. Yes. But you know, this was, I mean, that was one of the great things about that sort of that virgin period after, you know, the Sylvester McCoy era ended, and then before Paul McGann had his brief fleeting moment as the Doctor. There was sort of 5 or 6 years where writers increasingly realized nobody was paying any attention, and you could get away with almost anything, it felt like at times, and people did. Ben Aronovich certainly did. In Transit, I believe, is the most extreme example of that.
Absolutely, yes, the adult content. I mean, it's that time that's sort of disparagingly referred to as the wilderness years, isn't it? And I remember having a conversation with Paul Cornell about this, who really doesn't like the phrase at all, and I can see why. I think it's quite sort of, you know, it's quite derogatory, isn't it? Whereas actually it's a period of great creativity, and it was a time when lots of people who were in their 20s and 30s started their writing careers, people who've now gone on to work in television, and you know, gone on even to work in Doctor Who itself on television, or to have literary careers. So it was a very creative time.
Yeah, I mean, the virgin period on Doctor Who, it was hugely creative. They were able to do, if not anything they wanted, a lot. There was a lot of open doors. they had an open door submissions policy, which is incredibly rare in publishing these days. You know, you could be anybody, and as long as you pitched a good enough idea and could demonstrate you could write it, they let you do it no matter who you were, what your background was. You didn't need to have an agent, which is, if you want to be traditionally published by one of the big six these days, you have to have literary representation or win a competition, which is a lottery ticket way of approaching it. And yeah, it's proof of the success of that policy is how many people have then gone on to professional writing careers. Paul Cornell, Mark Gatiss, Rob Sherman, Gareth Roberts, the list goes on, Kate Orman. You know, so an awful lot of people got their start there and have gone on to careers in the creative industries directly as a result of that door being open and people being able to push through it.
And we were all frighteningly young. I mean, when I look back at mine, my first one, I was only 23. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't have an agent. And there's a lot that I would do very differently if I were to be doing it now. But as you say, here we are in middle age, and you can be relaunched. You can have another career, and here you are as D.B. Bishop doing historical crime, doing City of Vengeance, and I suppose people will be aware that you know, history and crime come together. I mean, there's been things that people will spring to people's mind, like Cadfael, for example, and the Marcus de Falco books by Lindsay Davis and the Roman Mysteries by Caroline Lawrence. Do you think crime and history are sort of natural bedfellows, perhaps? Are they people who write historical novels drawn to do crime and vice versa? Or
well, I think crime is a very good narrative engine. You know, it gives you an almost automatic structure in that a crime occurred, or there's the threat of a crime is going to occur. So that's your hook at the start of the story. And then your detective or your sleuth or your policeman, whoever it is either trying to prevent it or trying to find out who did it and why they did it, how they did it sometimes. And by the end of the narrative, they will have answered at least some of those questions. So it gives you an automatic structure.
yeah.
Now, the historical element, the joy of historical crime is, of course, it means that there are no mobile phones, which makes life so much harder for people watching. You know, you watch Line of Duty and go, why don't they just call each other, for goodness sakes? And there's no DNA. There's no fingerprint
testing, no DNA profiling. Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier, weren't we, about hamstring, about constraints versus freedom, and in a way, setting your book in the 16th century gives you enormous freedom because the crime can't be observed by CCTV, that there isn't any psychological profiling, forensics, and the challenge for someone who's doing a crime novel set in the present day is you've either got to have really good knowledge of police procedure, or you've got to have a really convincing amateur, haven't you? You've got to have a Miss Marple or an Agatha Raisin, and they've got to do all the things that the police can't do, whereas you've got a lot of freedom, and Aldo and his constable seem very much to almost as well act in quite a modern way. And I think that's what drew you to. They are court officials, but they act almost like a modern police force, being able to go and do house to house inquiries and build up the idea of the scene of the crime and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the sort of, I've been to panels in the past where people talk about historical fiction, one particular historical crime author who seems to believe there were no police forces anywhere in the world before the 19th century. And I'm like, not strictly true. And even if there weren't police forces as we understand them now, you know, a lot of these city-states and organizations and monarchies had spies. You know, spies have been with us for centuries upon centuries. So that's another form. It's the other strand of the crime fiction, is the thriller, the espionage element, where you have somebody who's either trying to prevent something or cause something to happen, or whatever the case may be. So it's to do with, you know, if it's not crime, then it's some sort of thriller, and that's normally to do with either the protection of power or the enforcement of power, or, you know, it's to do with personal freedoms versus the needs of the many or the state. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, Cesare Aldo and the constable, Carlo Strocchi, they do operate. It's because I found this book that talked about the criminal justice system in late Renaissance Florence was roughly comparable to a modern police force. They had officers who detected, they had constables who sort of patrolled and enforced. They had interrogations, they had witnesses, they had court cases, they had lawyers, they had all the things that we recognize as being a criminal justice system. Now, how they did their interviews of suspects or witnesses could involve torture. And equally, if somebody was deemed to be problematic as a prisoner, they could just be executed in the cells, as long as a priest was there to give them the final rites. So
Aldo is
in a
not
lot of ways it's similar to, but there's little differences as well.
Yeah, I noticed Aldo is not averse to a little knee to the groin with one particular person that he interrogates. And yes, I mean, you seem to enjoy your research. I mean, I actually hate research, but I'm writing something for children, which is set in Victorian times. And it was the first thing I've really written, which is historical. And the thing that I immediately come up against is you can't even describe somebody stepping outside their front door without having to research, you know, what the street's like and what would have been there. I had a scene where some characters go to the docks. I had to look up what the Victorian docklands would have been like, exactly who, you know, what kind of traders would have been there. So I mean, you've got your map of Florence, which is on your wall, and you've got that in your book as well, and so you've got that sort of visual reference. You obviously love the culture and the Italian language, so I'm assuming research is a pleasure for you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the biggest problem with research is that it's also a brilliant work displacement activity, in that you can like not write because you're busy, you need to know more facts about stuff. And as enjoyable as research is, and I've behind all the copies of City of Vengeance there, it's literally bookshelf, 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 bookshelf. It's just all reference books. Yeah. And there's more dotted around the house and various other places piled up waiting for me to read them. And I'm always acquiring new materials, which then usually contradict the previous, my understanding of events, which is like, oh. So with historical, you always have to write in the gaps between whatever the established facts are. But no, I mean, I love research. I mean, you know, obviously we're still in pandemic, semi-lockdown, so it's not like I'm rushing back to Florence this year, alas. So it's a couple of years since I've been back. But when I was working on the book or preparing to write the book, I certainly, you know, I spent the first week of January in Florence, specifically because that was the week that the book basically takes place over, because I wanted to find out, because, you know, in my head, you know, winter is always snow and everything else, but in Florence, it never gets down to zero and it just rains a bit and it's a cold wind, but that's about it.
Yeah, I've only been once and it was in the summer, so that's it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they get some frost, they get the odd frozen puddle, but that's about the shape of it. It doesn't get snow is very unusual in Florence. Whereas if you're further up country Milan, you'd see the snow on the Dolomites. But yeah, so it's I love the research element of it. The reality, then you have the balancing act between a tiny fraction of the research ends up actually on the page.
Yeah, exactly.
And the vast majority of it, you have to do it. You have to do the spade work, but then you have to realize the last thing you should do is put all that work on the page, because then you're making the reader suffer.
Yeah, this is, I do talks to kids in schools and I tell them about this and say, yeah, a lot of the work that you do behind the scenes won't actually show in the manuscript, but then you have the little telling details which really make you feel like you're in the hands of someone who knows what they're talking about. I mean, I remember things from your book like the wealthy character who has the mulberry sticks under his mattress to draw the fleas away, and I thought that's a nice little detail, show that only somebody who could afford to have a decent bedroom could do that. Yeah. And it's lovely when that little thing sort of thing comes out and you think, oh, that's something that David researched and obviously knows about. So yeah,
and it's and honestly, with the research, often the best books are the books that are aimed at children or the most simplistic books for research, because often they will tell you the color details that you can wade through a 600-page tome on, you know, the nature of the Medici and how they manipulated power and culture, which is all fascinating, but almost none of that will end up on the page. Whereas I've got a book that's a Renaissance Florence on 5 florins a day, which is hugely helpful.
Yeah. You want to know what people wore and how they spoke to each other and what they ate and how they went to the toilet and what kind of rubbish would end up in the river and what the stalls on the Ponte Vecchio would have sold and what they would have looked like, and all that. Yeah. All that is there.
Yeah, exactly. So often, you know, it's like like the horrible histories are, alas, I haven't found one for Renaissance Florence yet, but the horrible histories are a brilliant resource, and because they've got proper history underpinning them.
Sure.
And I think all research is about making the author of the book, making their version of history credible and seem authentic. And so it's that balancing act between, oh, I've discovered all these amazing facts, but I can't put them in the book because they don't fit in the story. Like the next book in the series is set in a convent. So I did a ton of reading around life in convents, both in Florence and other parts of Italy in this period, the century before, the century after. And this amazing sequence whereby the diocese, the archbishop and his priests, his clerics, were trying to close down this convent. So the nuns climbed on the roof and started hurling terracotta roof tiles down at the archbishop's men, all these monsignors and clerics going and having to retreat because they were being basically bombarded with terracotta, which if you get hit with a terracotta roof tile, you know about it.
Yeah, so you immediately thought you had to put that in.
And no, it can't go in the book. It doesn't fit in the book. Tonally, it's wrong for the book. And you just go, oh, that's so frustrating. That's a brilliant moment. Yeah. You just go, well, I'll just use that in interviews instead.
You just mention it. Yes, we can talk about lots of things, but I wanted to talk to you just about something which interests me, which is the different viewpoints in the book, because it's something I do in my school workshops. I get kids to try and understand the concept of viewpointing, and how even when you're doing a third person narrative, you are still inside someone's head. I think you've got about a dozen different viewpoints, and I'm only halfway through the book, but that's what I've counted so far. It's very hard to balance them all, isn't it? I mean, it's like spinning plates, really.
Yeah, because the big challenge is you have to make each one distinctive from another. So obviously Aldo is he's the protagonist of the book, he's the main protagonist, so we're with him the most. Yeah. But also we're with Strachey, that's the constable that he works alongside at times. We get the point of view. How else do we get? We get Cosimo Domici's mother, Maria. She proves quite an important character. The daughter of the Jewish moneylender, Rebecca, we get her. And there's a few others sort of sprinkled along the way. Those are the major ones. But each of those, in order to make those credible and make them distinctive, you should be able to read them without knowing whose section it is. It should be obvious. And so therefore you have to make the character's register distinctive, which is sometimes called character voice. So, and on the course I teach, we break it down into 3 elements. So we talk about vocabulary, which is obviously the constrained palette of words and phrases that a character uses regularly due to their background and their upbringing and their education, such as that may be. Then it's rhythm, which is how syntax suggests their emotional status at any given moment in that scene, how they're feeling. Like some people, when they're nervous, will babble, 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 and other people shut down and become monosyllabic. So rhythm helps communicate a sense of the character's emotional state. And that's both in their heads if we have access to their thoughts and feelings, but also when they're speaking aloud if we don't have access to their thoughts and feelings. And then tone, which is their attitude. And that's hugely important if is a character's, are they a stoic? Are they melancholic? Are they cynical? Are they world weary? Are they an ingenue? Are they wide-eyed? All these sorts of things. And so by manipulating those 3 aspects of register, you can have characters who are siblings, and yet their register, their voice is distinctly different from one another because like their default setting of attitude, one's a loner and monosyllabic, and one's garrulous and egregious and whatever the case may be. So they're all different, even though their vocabulary is basically going to be the same. They've been brought up together and had the same education and probably doing the same job. They all work on a farm, and yet their attitudes will be different, and that will come across in how they express themselves and how they think. So that's the challenge, absolutely.
Yeah,
and you have to be able to.
It's really interesting to hear how you teach it, because as a writer, I do it intuitively, and sometimes it's quite hard to explain how you do it. And yeah, I've noted down those 3 things: vocabulary, rhythm, and tone, and I shall steal those, mention them.
Steal away, because it's
mainly young people I work with, but it's just as valid. I think they're trying to work out how do you tell a story in the third person, and they don't always immediately grasp it. So. And I had 12 viewpoints in Exiles, and I found that really hard going because I've never had that many before. And some of them were quite minor characters too. And So
Yeah.
yeah, so I'm interested to see how you've handled that. That's been really fascinating. Good stuff.
Yeah. And the challenge then, I think, is also it's that you have to be able to replicate it again and again and drop back into that character. It's almost like, okay, I'm writing an Aldo scene, so therefore I will now method write myself into Aldo, how he's feeling. He's just been beaten up, he's bleeding. He's like, how does it feel? And a lot of it's to do with the sensory elements, like City of Vengeance. I remember years ago I wrote I was commissioned to write a Nightmare on Elm Street novel. And normally when you write one of those tie-in novels, you have to do a very lengthy chapter breakdown and demonstrate you have the totality of the story ready to play out. And therefore you can, I used my chapter breakdowns to be 10,000 words long. So then when the time came to write the book, it'd just be like, add dialogue and description, and off we go.
Yeah.
Great. And so I pitched to write a Nightmare on Elm Street novel. And then 6 months later, they came back and said, yeah, go for it. Okay. And I went, brilliant. Okay. So I printed out my synopsis. It was a 100,000 word book. And my synopsis was 3 pages long. And I went, well, I'm in trouble here. I haven't got enough story to fill 100,000 words. So I put the sign on the wall that just said, describe everything, which is actually not the best advice in the world. The other question I had on the wall was like, how does it smell? Because a lot of books don't use, a lot of writers don't use a sense of smell.
It's the most evocative sense of your childhood and of memories. So yeah.
And you just trigger people instantly. So like the next book, there's lavender in a courtyard inside the cloisters of this convent. So I'm constantly referencing the smell of the whole book. It just stinks of lavender now. Because I always remember there's one of the Andrew Cartmel Doctor Who tie-in New Adventures. I think it's Warlock, Warchild maybe. Anyway, it's the smell of mushrooms being rehydrated in hot water is the smell of a drug in the book. And the whole book just stinks of mushrooms.
Yes, one that I use with children is the opening of Moondial by Helen Cresswell, because that's got the first page where there's a character who is the metaphor she uses is blindfolded by the night, and the character can't see, so all the other senses have to be used. So it's a wonderful sort of one-page masterclass in how to describe a character moving through a landscape without actually using the visual, and that really opens kids' eyes to how you can describe using all the other 4 senses, because you get a lot of young people who, when they don't read, and they'll play video games, and so they'll be able to describe the audio visual really well, but they'll forget to put in the smells, the tastes, and the texture, how something feels to the hand, because they just think in audio visual terms. It's and it's also the thing about I always have to, I'm talking to my students, I'm always saying to them, you're not obliged to describe everything. Describe the things that your character would notice in this moment. Yes.
Because we don't notice things that are the same every day, because they're the same every day. We notice difference and we notice novelty. It's only if you haven't met somebody for a year do you think, oh, you've gotten taller, or you've gotten thinner, or what happened to your hairline in my case. But it's sort of, but if you see them every day, you don't notice the fact of whatever it is. It's like, I cut my hair once a month, but my wife never notices because it never gets more than yay long. So therefore it's just the tiny gradations of change.
It's a terrible trap that some first-time novelists will fall into as well, of having the character stop in the hallway and look at themselves in the mirror, describe themselves.
Oh, no, don't do it. You're not in bad porn. Don't do it.
Terrible. Yes. David, it's been really interesting. Thank you so much for coming along and talking to me on the Blythe tapes and about all the stuff that you've done. And we've really only touched on a lot of very interesting things, but City of Vengeance is published now by D.V. Bishop, who is David Bishop, and it's in hardback and ebook, and there's going to be a paperback, I assume, sometime.
It's already out in audiobook. And then it's out in paperback, I think January, and then the second book, whose title I am contractually obliged not to say aloud, will follow in March 2022.
Your publishers seem to have done a fantastic job on it. It's a very, very handsome volume, I think, and very...
I'm very happy. Good distinctive cover, blood red, because it's a pretty bloody book.
And I'm very keen to find out who did it, so I'm going to carry on reading and hope to be surprised. David, thanks very much for your time. It's been great talking to you, and good luck with everything else that you do.
Thank you very much. Be my pleasure.